to? Any of us? Well, I think just from what we know is that listen to them as an individual. Part of what I said there is I am Susie. So quite often when I go in for a healthcare appointment, as soon as I say type 2 diabetes, I can almost see the mind shifting. Oh, obesity, type 2, and I'm being pigeonholed that way. You've got to listen to an individual. So I suppose when I said I walked into a gym, people don't expect somebody at 25 stone to walk into a gym. So just talk to them as a person and ask them their history with exercise and activity and what they want.
And the other thing is, by having my own personal stigma, or each of us who has obesity, are we then contributing to the problem? I don't judge anybody else on their size. I judge if they're a nice person, if they're intelligent, funny, whatever. They're things that catch my eye. But for me, it's a terrible analysis. So am I part of the problem then? Are we part of the problem when we stigmatise ourselves?
Maybe I'll take that one. But and just to respond to your first point, and building on what Susie said, I think we are in a position where we're celebrating individual differences and the reasons why people have different experiences. Maybe you have different long-term health conditions and so on in other spaces, but we don't do that in obesity. And all of this move towards personalising and tailoring healthcare, for instance, we're celebrating that again in many other spaces, but obesity is just about eat less and move more. And then the second point is you're certainly not contributing to weight stigma. What you're reflecting is what's happening in society. And it's only natural, therefore, that you're internalising weight stigma. And now, while weight stigma is obviously very evident and is typically directed towards people living with obesity, weight stigma is experienced by people right across the population. And so the reasons why, for instance, people who might be in the underweight or healthy weight or overweight ranges have different types of eating or dietary or physical activity behaviours and so on, many instances that's attributed to their experiences of weight stigma. And it might also be their attempts to try and avoid weight gain, for instance, which is linked to weight stigma. So yes, you're certainly not to blame and you're certainly not contributing to weight stigma. It's a reflection of society, so it's only natural.
Anyone else from the floor? There is a roving mic, and actually the people who are online will hear better if we use the mic, so I should have said that before we ask the questions there. I do have a question. Actually, Sarah or Johnny, before I move on, do you want to come in on any of those questions? No? You're okay? So the question I have from Vanessa is, this week is Anti-Bullying Week. How could we get obesity stigma info into school programmes?
Can I direct that to Niamh? Actually, because she might know a bit more about that.
Niamh, do you want to... Oh, there's a mic.
Leona, I shouldn't have made eye contact with you.
Sorry.
So I've worked with some schools in the past on healthy eating guidelines, but I think in terms of actually bullying, it kind of needs to come from maybe a more policy-driven approach. And we know from a lot of the research in other areas that when it comes to education, it is about getting that education out there and working with institutions and organisations such as the Department of Education and actually presenting and explaining to help their understanding. I think we've heard from many speakers today that there is just a big paucity out there. There's a big gap in people's understanding. People don't mean most of the time to be hurtful. They don't realise that they're causing harm or that they're doing damage. But the issue is that it causes such negative consequences, and it just, excuse the pun as a dietitian, but it feeds into these vicious cycles that are not helpful or helpful either. So from a broader approach in schools, it's about advocating. So perhaps maybe there's individuals in particular schools out there, parent committees, parent associations are great, and getting their voice heard. It's about then getting the Department of Education on board, and again, getting it streamlined so that it's actually in policy and from a policy approach. But it really needs a lot of encouragement and support, and can happen, but not without people power. There's so much evidence that shows that on average it takes 17 years from research to translate into policy and into practice. So we really need everyone to be shouting out about this and about why it needs to be addressed and having that power behind it. That's just my 2 pence of it, or worth.
If I maybe add a few there.
Please.
Certainly not an exhaustive list, but definitely I think listening to younger people, and as I've mentioned in my talk, it's the most common reason that children and young people report experiences of bullying now. In terms of getting more action in schools, well, there's lots of work that shows that these experiences are impacting educational engagement, educational attainment. So, they should be, very strong reasons for why schools want to engage on this topic. Linked to what Niamh just mentioned there, one of the things that I talk about when we think about whole systems approaches, and there's been this whole focus on whole systems approaches, is we often then just leave obesity with typically the health departments within governments. But the reality is if you want a whole systems approach, well, we need Department of Education, we need work and pensions, we need all of the different departments to be engaged on the topic if we're going to have a system-wide approach. So I think they are key. And probably the last point I'll mention is sometimes it's also about taking weight out of the equation, and actually, of course, we will talk about weight-inclusive spaces. But I have my slide on there about what discrimination represents. And the question is who in a school is going to say bullying is acceptable, victimization is acceptable, harassment is acceptable, and again, this is what the experiences of weight stigma represent. So if we're advocating to say discrimination is not acceptable, harassment is not acceptable, victimization is not acceptable, well, whether it's about weight or about another topic, it's all unacceptable.
Absolutely. I have sorry, Sue, please come in.
But just on that, what worries me is that sometimes things are half-hearted in how they're done, that it might look like it's, being tackled and then it's not. So I've gone back a couple of years ago, and I don't know all the full details because my memory's gone on it, but it is an initiative that takeaway food places weren't to be built or opened within so many metres of a school. And then after that coming in, 6 months later, there was a takeaway built near a school. Like, if we're going to have these initiatives, if we're going to have these policies, they've got to be implemented properly. It's got to be done properly, not just, like when you said, Stuart, how many policies have been written. That's what I worry about. I think in Ireland we have some great 10-year action plans, but really, are they fully being taken on board? I think that's where our model of care and the new guidelines come in, that we've all collectively got to make this happen.
Absolutely. I'm going to move back to an online question now, and this came up in a couple of different talks, so please feel free to answer as you see fit. Does lifestyle messaging have a place in public health? If so, how can we promote lifestyle messages relating to eating behaviours, for example, portion sizes, without stigmatising people living with obesity? So that was kind of one of the controversies of some of the talks.
I don't think there's anything wrong with advocating around that. It's how, I think we've heard a lot today around how language matters, and it's adopting inclusive language, and don't put out the message there that the only way we can approach a healthy lifestyle is simply by eating less and moving more. There are certainly other ways of promoting healthy lifestyles. That's my short but discreet answer on that, is that language does matter, and how we communicate matters. And just to be aware, I mean, I did see something recently on Twitter, I'm not 100% sure who it is, I don't know if it's Healthy Ireland again actually, where if you're in your 20s, if you get more sleep, you're less prone to put on weight in your... Who was doing that?
Yeah, so there was a recent Healthy Ireland campaign, and I was on a meeting for about last November last year, and I was quite worried at what direction it was going, because it really was eat less, move more, and wasn't kind of on board with how it was going. But I think our reflections were taken, because when the campaign came out, it had vastly changed, and I was really delighted to see that, I have to say. It didn't just go, and they took out even exercise and food. It was nutrition and activity, and stress and sleep were part of the campaign, and it was aimed at 20-year-olds who, I tried to explain, at that point you don't know what self-internalized stigma is. So in your 20s, you haven't done enough of the regain, lose, regain, all of that to know what stigma is fully. You do know it, but you don't know fully. So I was delighted to see that the campaign was really a lot better than it had started out to be. So I think we're getting there.
We're getting better campaigns. I'd love to hear from any of you whether you've seen pockets of really good practice, and what does that look like in any setting, whether it's healthcare or society. What does good look like that you can put your finger on?
Well, just that we were asked to come to that meeting to see what we thought of the campaign, involving the people who it involves. You know, nothing without us, you know, that's huge. That's a huge step forward.
Yeah. That's a little bit telling now that you can't give me examples of good practice. We will get there. For Johnny, a question coming in online. If you could go back in time, what would you tell yourself?
So I guess the thing I would tell myself would be to focus more on myself as a person. So in the talk I mentioned about how I was only 16 and the first job I had, I was kind of a risk. So I was kind of an awkward teenager, so I was always really tall and naturally really big. So I guess I would just tell myself to do what I do now and kind of portray the best version of myself and treat people how I want to be treated. And I guess that's something that comes with time and experience. But I would definitely tell myself just to focus on the positives of myself and don't let myself dwell too much on the way people kind of treat and look at me based on who I am, because I know I'm a good person and I try and be a helpful person. And I've got a kind of saying that I always try and be the person I want to meet. And I think I'll just tell myself to not change who I am as a person, but maybe focus a little bit more on the negative side of things that I experienced, in the sense of being portrayed as a risk or being kind of socially awkward just in how I looked, because how I look doesn't reflect me as a person. It just reflects a 6'7" massive organisms, you know, like who I am is in here. So I think that's something I'd try and portray in a more in-depth and confident demeanour to which I do now. So I hope that answers the question.
I have another question here online, and this is probably a tough one. What should one do if you witness a parent or family member, this is an issue you raised, Susie, stigmatising their son or daughter, no matter what age, about their weight, what they're eating, their eating habits, or their lack of exercise?
Well, we had a man contact us recently, and this just shows how powerful it is, what we're all doing, and how important it is to keep talking. He had heard us 4 months before, and him and his wife took 4 months to come and contact us, that their 19-year-old daughter is struggling with her weight and is one of 3 girls, and it is constant rows in the house, and they didn't know what to do. So they're asking us what we thought. And I said, for a start right now, if she's getting upset by it, stop talking to her about it in the home in front of her sisters. And he came to one of our meetings and listened in, and that was a starting point. So I think just having these conversations and letting people know there is support out there. I think it is particularly hard when stigma's within the family. I know my friend has 4 children, and I walked in one day and she was saying, Scott, if you eat up all the carrots, I'll get you a nice ice cream afterwards. And I said to her, do you know the words you're using, what that's implying? And she said, what do you mean? I said, why not say finish your dinner and we'll go to the park? And she was like, I never even thought about it. Never even thought about how my words matter. So I think it's just having the conversations.
I have a question for Sarah from our online participants. What other psychological supports should be available, and should these be available in childhood?
Absolutely. I think from my perspective, I know that a lot of my thinking about myself is in my head. So I think things like counselling and having talking therapies is really important, so that you can start having that conversation with someone that's not a friend or a family member or someone that's kind of associated with you, because I find that you obviously don't get the greatest advice sometimes, because people are obviously always thinking about you, whereas I think if you're talking to a professional, they frame it in a way that you might think differently and look at things in a different way. So from my perspective, counselling has helped me massively. I also think that various things like CBT, that I know Johnny mentioned he did, and various other techniques that are out there are all really helpful. I think the thing that's not helpful at the moment, definitely within England anyway, is that when we have got psychological support available, it's limited, and you get given like 6 sessions or something. And it's kind of like, again, this is where the personalised approach needs to come in, because for some people 6 sessions might be great and that might be fine, but for others you might need 60 sessions. So to have that restrictions, really not kind of looking at the individual and supporting them to what they might need. So I think it's about making sure that there's like a choice and that people can pick and choose what works for them. And it's not this kind of like, you have to do X, Y, and Z. It's about understanding what might be the right thing for that individual person. And for some people, support groups and peer-to-peer and listening to what other people have gone through is really important and a great way of helping people not feel alone and know that they're not going through this on their own. So that can be really powerful and supportive as well. So I think it's looking at kind of, the right thing for the individual is important.
Johnny, you mentioned mental health supports throughout your presentation. I don't know if you want to come in and add anything to that.
Yeah, no problem at all. So just as I was saying there, I'm somebody who has had 60 sessions of therapy, and I still am in therapy now. And anything to do with mental health, just like living with obesity or any disease or illness, it just can't be a broad stroke across the board. Everybody's uniquely different in everything. So, for someone to get 6 sessions, like when my wife lost her father, she got 6 sessions for bereavement counselling, which was enough just to get her over that initial period in time in which she was struggling. But for myself, my schemas were a lot more deep-rooted, so it took a more continual approach, as well as working with Obesity UK and the ECPO. Involved kind of locally here with some of the men's mental health charities, because it's something I kind of hold dear to my heart. And I come from a family of, you don't talk about problems, you just go on with it. And again, from being the physical side of change that I want to be, I know that transparency and how you're feeling is, to me, is something that is crucial to get over any hurdle. I think it's important to talk. It's important to let people know where you're at physically and mentally, and I think that the more support we get from that side of things could have a massive positive effect on people who are challenged with obesity. Because like for me, I was, and I guess I still am, an emotional eater. So instead of speaking up, I would personally eat. So now I have that confidence to talk and say how I'm feeling. When I was feeling suicidal last year, I never spoke to my wife at all until it was too late, where I was beyond rock bottom. And now if I'm having a bad day, I'm quite comfortable just to say, not having a great day, and kind of explain why. So I think when you get the training and the time to develop yourself, it makes it that bit easier to not bottle things up, and for things to overwhelm you, you can just have that natural conversation and say you're not okay, which I think is the most powerful tool I've learned through everything this past couple of years is just to have open dialect with people, especially the ones that you're closest with and nearest and dearest.
Thank you, Johnny. We have time for one last question. Jennifer, you have the mic.
Thank you, Aileen. I just wanted to ask a question of the panel in relation to, it's very hard to access healthcare. You hear it all the time from everybody, be they obese or non-obese. There are numerous barriers to accessing healthcare. And what I'm hearing from your talks today is that there are even more barriers to accessing healthcare and the kind of interventions you might need if you are an obese person. And what could we do to develop strategies to overcome that fundamental barrier so that people can get the care that they need, which is not affected by them being obese. It is just healthcare that they need to access. So I'd be very interested to hear if there was your views on that, basically.
I think one problem that we see in our support groups is quite a lot of people say, I haven't been referred for weight management because the wait list is so long, what's the point? And we say to them, be referred, because then the government doesn't know the full extent of the problem if you're not being referred in the first place. But it's overstretched. Yes, but they need to know. Because it's 60% of Irish people living with overweight or obesity. That's a huge amount of people who aren't being referred. When we look at the long waiting lists, they should be longer. They're not realistic. So if we don't know the true picture, well then we can't push for change. We can't push for more treatment. We can't push for access to treatment if the government thinks we're doing okay, even though we're not. So people need to be referred, regardless of what treatment option they go for. They need to be referred immediately.
Just to add to that, actually, is just that weight stigma does actually perpetuate that as well, unfortunately, because if obesity is viewed as not as important as other chronic diseases, then the funding is not going to be applied to it. And again, I think that's something that we really need to focus on. And certainly even how we speak about obesity, and that to remind us that our language does matter as well, and how we present to other people our ideas around people living with obesity is important. And to recognise that the problem that we have in our systemic infrastructure is fueled by weight stigma. And we can dress it up any way we want, but it is pervasive across every single setting, as Stuart has spoken to earlier, and its impact is the most detrimental in our healthcare systems.
And we find it difficult to sit here and talk about the personal experience because quite often people feel as we're looking for sympathy, but we're not, because if we don't actually talk about the real challenges of day-to-day living with obesity and stigma in particular, then how can any of you treat us? How can any healthcare professional treat us properly if you don't know what the problem is? Because, as we said, we've hidden it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really nice note.
Obesity as well as a gateway disease. So often at the moment the approach is that, all these, obesity occurs, and then unfortunately it has lots of other different complications that are associated with obesity, and they're focused on, there's different pathways of care and different services for treating diabetes, for treating cardiovascular disease or heart disease, for treating different types of cancers. But all of these diseases can result from the obesity. So why not treat the obesity first and prevent that? Not only does it make economic sense, but I'm so sorry. Not only does it make economic sense, but also for their individual as well, their quality of life. You're reducing the amount of health implications of the obesity for that individual. The pressure and the demands then knock-on effect on the health services. So it really needs to be seen that treating obesity first, and obviously, of course, we need to treat other complications as well. But obesity is a gateway disease, and it needs to be seen as that. And that's what I mentioned earlier, that even though it's been recognised as a disease since 1948 by the World Health Organization, a lot of people still don't understand that or still don't know that. So we really need to get that out there. And just because I work in childhood obesity, there is free online education for healthcare professionals to help, as a measure to help reduce the stigma encountered when treating children. And it's at childhoodobesity.ie. So yeah, just going to get.
Afraid, folks, we will have to leave it there. I know there are questions still from the floor, and there are still questions online that we haven't had time to answer. I think we could be here discussing this all day. Really appreciate the panel and your participation, so thank you very much.